Hi, Tom. It's good to be with you. Um, so the problem is just 6.5 million citizens were suffering from hunger in 2019. That's about 11% of the population. So just to give you an overview of the severity of the situation, in the Western Cape during the hard lockdown, 800,000 people needed social relief and food parcels. And we still know that that wasn't enough to cover the severity and how strict the lockdown was. So the alcohol ban and the cigarette ban lost accordingly 7.5 million rand in excess taxes. And while the wine industry lost about 21,000 jobs. So you can see how the level of the severity of our lockdown and how strict it was impacted South Africa's economy negatively. And we see this spilling over into childhood poverty, um, where it's much more severe. And so we see that that childhood poverty has a longer term effect. So it's not as if the lockdown ends tomorrow, everything goes back to normal. Poverty and hunger will continue to increase because of the long term ramifications and the consequences of the hard lockdown. Now, certainly some regulations were needed and necessary, but the extent of the lockdown and the extent of the regulations such as the e-commerce ban earlier on during the hard lockdown level 5 was to much extent really unfounded and unscientific. So we see that things like that and small regulations that had a major impact on job losses in South Africa is impacting the hunger crisis far more severe. And so today, we don't really know the extent of hunger currently in the country. It's grown tremendously, obviously, but we don't know the full extent of it just yet.
So, when we talk about hunger and we are put in a corner to define what hunger is, and at what point we say, hunger is and poverty are linked, what is hunger? At what point do we say you are now, suffering from hunger?
So what the studies have found is that most people, the study you referred to, is that a lot of adults reported not to have been able to buy any food uh, in April. So we see that even a grant like 350 Rand is not going to do much to buy groceries for the week, let alone the month. So people in South Africa are plainly not being able to buy any food whatsoever, or in the case of childhood poverty, aren't able to get enough nutrients that requires them to develop as human beings. And that has a longer term effect in terms of early childhood development. And then it spills over into economic disparities because a child who doesn't get sufficient education can't perform well at school and can't perform well later on in life. So hunger is really what we say it is, where people can't have any, don't have enough income to buy food, or in the case of childhood poverty, it's the case where the child isn't getting the enough nutrients it needs to develop as a human being. So we see that South Africa, particularly with the grant saga, the 350 Rand grant, many people were still not getting it. Um, so a lot of people were not even being able to get the 350, and the 350 wasn't even enough to cover groceries for anybody's month. Um, so the full extent of hunger in South Africa and the world is really, or particularly to South Africa, is really where people aren't able to buy any food to support themselves, even if it's within a week or within a month, or within a few days, like 7 days, etc.
I want to make reference to the General House survey that was conducted. And this survey showed that between 2002 and 2018, the rate of hunger in household actually halved. It went from 35% of households saying that they suffer from hunger to 16% of households. If we look at that time span, and perhaps the interventions that were put in place to influence that reduction in hunger, what does it point to? What are the reasons for that reduction?
So we see that from 1994 to 2007, South Africa had its biggest economic growth, particularly because the governing party took a line of employing free market principles into the economy. After 2007, we saw that because of the economic crisis and the recession, the government then took a position to employ more state intervention into the economy, which stifled growth significantly till today. So that's why we saw that that statistic halved itself in that time frame when the economy was growing rapidly because of free market ideas into the economy, boosting investments. Currently, we have a capital flight out of the country because of private property rights being under threat. So we see that the Heritage Foundation's Index for Economic Freedom pred- predicts one of the categories for economic freedom is the strength of private property, and countries with strong property rights have significantly higher incomes. And South Africa's incomes have been falling, unemployment has been increasing rapidly. We actually have one of the highest unemployments since 1994. The youth unemployment rate is 59%. The expanded definition of unemployment is 42%. So we're seeing that the economy is constricting so severely in South Africa currently because of the anti-market policies that have been pushed into South Africa's economy, like the minimum wage or other regulations that are hampering the business environment, and it trickles down to poorer communities, and they feel it much harder because when a business has to lay off its workers because the government decided to intervene into the economy to restrict those businesses, we see that those those individuals lose their jobs and aren't able to provide enough for their families. They usually can buy a bread, milk, the basic necessities. And once they lose that income because of things like the minimum wage or any other regulations that are imposed on businesses like higher taxes, we see that those individuals can't provide for their families. So because of free market policies during that time of 1994 to 2007, when Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki were respectively presidents during that time, we saw that South Africa's economy, the middle class, grew exponentially during that time. Unemployment was halving significantly. South Africa was one of the fastest performing emerging economies in the world. And after that, after 2007, when Jacob Zuma came into power, and the ANC decided to impose itself on the free market, on the economy, that's when we saw poverty start to rise again. And today we are sitting with a huge humanitarian crisis in the country.
Ryan, government has acknowledged the possible impact of COVID-19. They did this right at the beginning when lockdowns were instituted. They introduced the 350 Rand social grant. Food parcels became the order of the day. But what else could government have done to try and relieve the impact of COVID-19 on South Africa's poor?
So the grants were a really good thing because it did provide immediate relief to many people. But what we did see is that corruption took place, widespread corruption did take place. And that's why you started to see the grants that should have been allocated not be allocated. So I would argue if those grants were allocated, the catastrophe would not be as severe as it is today. However, the government decided, or certain officials within the government decided, to use certain relief funding um, to fund their own lifestyle in certain ways or another. And so they stole from the poor. And so that's why we're in this catastrophic situation where the government are sitting with a predicament on their hands. On the one hand, they are banning alcohol, jobs are being destroyed, decimated, incomes are decreasing, the government needs to provide more funding, more relief funding. Um, and that just heightens their problem and the quagmire that they find themselves in. So they created this problem. But I would argue that if corruption wasn't as rampant in the country like it is under the current administration, we would see that they would be able to provide more. But moreover, it is important to recognize that the study also found that certain grant relief funding is not being used in the way that it should be used. And that is particularly alarming because if a household is getting an X amount of money and they're not using it to buy food for their children, that obviously exacerbates the situation, and it compounds it even despite the fact that the government is providing funding. So one of the recommendations is that food vouchers could have instead been issued because they're electronic, number one, so no contact with individuals need to happen for that to be transferred, and then the food voucher can be immediately redeemed at the vendor. So those are some of the solutions that could be looked at in the future or even currently to relieve the government from this. But more importantly, it helps people claim economic autonomy over their own lifestyles. Um, Going to get a food parcel and get a grant somewhere is not particularly dignifying to people in South Africa. And so allowing them to have food vouchers where they're able to go shopping to buy food, etc., would also aid in just allowing the social construct of society to be able to say that um, people have dignity. South Africans have dignity. Poor South Africans have dignity, and they aren't able to. They don't need to queue for long hours like they're currently doing, and still not getting anything because officials decided to waste the money that was allocated in the first place. So the government is to blame for what is happening currently. The pandemic just highlighted how deep that destruction truly is, and it's starting to come out slowly, incrementally, and we've seen the devastation of 26 years, or arguably even 10 years of inefficient governance has produced in the country.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for your insights and your contribution to this conversation today.